listener production.
Hi there, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. It has been a month since the horrific attack at Bondi Junction Westfield, during which a man stabbed 18 people, killing 6. Most of his victims were women. The event was heavily reported on by the media, and in the wake of the tragedy, we've seen dozens more instances of violent knife crime right around Australia. It may feel like we are seeing an increase in these sort of attacks, but is that true? That conversation coming up in the second half of today's episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Bension Siebert. It's Tuesday, May 14.
Good morning, Sasha. Bail laws for domestic violence offenders are being tightened in New South Wales under proposed reforms in the wake of growing anger at the deaths of women at the hands of a current or former partner. The New South Wales government's cabinet signed off on the proposed changes overnight. The government will introduce legislation into the state's parliament that would reverse the presumption of bail for those accused. That means alleged offenders will need to explain why they should be let out if they've been charged with any of several serious domestic violence offences.
Yeah, and another reform will be ankle monitoring bracelets for those who do get out on bail. According to Femicide Watch, 35 women have been killed by a man already in 2024. That's a 30% increase on last year's figures. And I wanted to have a look at what other states are doing. You know, we saw the protest marches a couple of weeks ago, lots of coverage by the media, lots of anger from the public at what's been happening. So how have we seen other states respond? So last week, South Australia introduced strict ankle monitoring of DV offenders on bail. The Victorian government hasn't looked at bail laws or ankle monitoring at this stage as far as we're aware, but they are considering giving police the power to permanently ban family violence perpetrators from interacting with victims. Queensland recently made coercive control illegal. New South Wales is the only other state that has those laws. WA is looking at similar laws to what we're seeing happening in New South Wales, but they are yet to be legislated. And as far as I could see, there are no major reforms that have been announced in the ACT or Northern Territory. So, you know, states are taking these steps to respond to this huge amount of anger. But, I mean, you could easily say that there's a lot more that needs to be done. So these laws in New South Wales, I think, are what a lot of advocates have been calling for.
Elon Musk's X will no longer be forced to remove videos of the Wakeley church stabbing after the federal court rejected an application to extend the ban. The temporary ban was set by the eSafety Commissioner to block over 65 websites that had clips of Bishop Mari Emanuel being attacked until it was determined whether X breached any laws by hosting the videos. Musk has described the situation as censorship, while Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called him an arrogant billionaire for his objections to taking down the video, with other platforms like Meta taking it down quickly when asked. Now, the ban was only for Australian users, as X refused to block it globally on the grounds that one country's rules shouldn't have to apply to the internet across the planet. But the eSafety Commissioner argued that a ban that only applied to Australian users was ineffective because a lot of Aussies use VPNs that disguise their locations. Musk's lawyer in the case also argued that the video wasn't that graphic. There will be a further hearing on Wednesday because the injunction was temporary, so the court could still rule in the eSafety Commissioner's favour.
The Treasurer will hand down his budget tonight. It'll likely be his last before we head to the polls next year. Can you believe we are voting in a federal election again so soon? Jim Chalmers is expected to announce back-to-back surpluses for the first time since the GFC back in 2008. Now, the government is forecasting a $9.3 billion surplus, which is lower than several independent estimates. So what else can we expect tonight? Well, Chalmers has been quick to quell any ideas of a cash-splashing budget. He's got the difficult task of trying to come up with cost of living relief without adding to inflation. But we do know the Stage 3 tax cuts will form a big part of that relief. There have been hints at changes to job seeker payments and a new benefit for people studying courses that include a mandatory work placement. And the government also announced this month that HECS debts will be slashed under indexation changes. And there'll be a $925 million spend on help for people fleeing domestic violence situations. Now, budgets can be a little bit boring, a little bit bogged down in numbers, but we will have you covered tomorrow morning with the stuff that we think matters the most to you, our wonderful listeners, and that'll be from tomorrow morning at 6 with Katrina Blowers.
And celebrities and influencers have lost hundreds of thousands of social media followers over the last week following lavish displays of wealth at the Met Gala. The hashtag #Blockout2024 has been picking up steam, with people choosing to boycott celebs who've chosen to remain silent about the war in Gaza.
We need to only encourage people or be silent and just block them and move away. Because when you comment shaming people for finally speaking up about it, it discourages others from speaking up about it.
That was listeners Abby Chatfield there talking about the movement.
Yeah, and others are walking away because of frustration, at the deepening divide between the rich and poor. A lot of videos have been made of the celebs at the Met Gala last week in their amazing costumes to the music of the Hunger Games. Now, if you haven't seen it, it basically, I'm not going to do a whole rundown of what happens in the Hunger Games, but there's this big conversation in those movies and the books about the rich in one part and the poor who are dealing with poverty and famine and all these things, and people are linking it to celebrities right now and what's happening in Gaza. Now, among those losing followers, Kim Kardashian, she's down 318,000. Taylor Swift, who wasn't even at the Met Gala, lost 200,000. And Selena Gomez has copped a 292,000 hit. Now, I don't know if you're up to date on your celeb watching on social media, Bension. I definitely am. And this all seemed to really kick off. I saw two major events post the Met Gala that seemed to really get people fired up. There's a influencer called Hailey Bailey, and she was in her elaborate costume and she mouthed the words to that iconic line out of Marie Antoinette movie, Let Them Eat Cake. That people weren't very happy with that. And also Lizzo, who hasn't said anything about what's been going on in Gaza, posted a video asking her followers to donate to causes aiding those in Gaza. And people, I think understandably, were like, hang on, we're your poor lowly followers who, work 9 to 5s and, struggle to get by. We're in a cost of living crisis right around the world. You're a multi-millionaire and you're saying, can you guys please donate? Like, I get why it's left a bad taste in people's mouths.
Yeah, a lot of very uncomfortable content coming out on the internet. I think I saw a video where images of explosions and children looking like they're starving in hospitals and spliced against images of the Met Gala, and God, it's just really uncomfortable. So I think people on the internet making a very strong point.
Yeah, absolutely. Bension, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we are getting into our deep dive on whether there has been an increase in knife crime in Australia in the wake of the Bondi Junction attack. In the months since the attack at Bondi Junction, Australia has seen several more high-profile crimes involving knives. There was the incident in Perth a little over a week ago where a 16-year-old boy was shot dead after randomly attacking a bystander. In the New South Wales town of Lake Macquarie, a 17-year-old girl has been accused of stabbing her 10-year-old sister to death. In Coffs Harbour, a surfer was stabbed and killed after an early morning surf. A teenage boy in Melbourne sent a shopping centre into lockdown after threatening shoppers with a machete. And back in Sydney, a bishop was brutally stabbed, allegedly by a teenage boy, while presenting a sermon in a church. The event live-streamed to thousands of people on YouTube. That's not to mention dozens of other instances in towns and cities all over the country. It certainly feels like we're seeing an increase in violent knife crime, and both Queensland and New South Wales have moved to expand random checks for the weapons in public, seemingly in response to recent incidents. But are we actually seeing more stabbing attacks? And how much has it got to do with media reporting? I'm joined now by criminologist Xanthe Mallett, who's an associate professor at the University of Newcastle, to find out if more media coverage means more knife crime. Xanthe, thanks for your time today. Do you think that we are seeing a rise based on all of the incidents we've had? I say in the last month since Bondi, it feels like it's gotten more intense in that time period. Do you think when we get new stats, it'll reflect an increase in knife crime?
Well, I think we're talking about a number of different things here because knives are used by different groups across the community, different demographics. So I think it will certainly demonstrate an increase in knife crime amongst young people. So the most recent data we have was released in June 2023, and that covered 2022. So we're going to be looking at last year's data when that's released in June this year. And I think it will show that young people are carrying knives more in public and are actually using them more in public. So we're definitely seeing an increase in that particular group across the country. It's not just in one state. So I think it will be reflective in the data that we are seeing decreases generally, but increases with specific demographics.
The Bondi Junction attack was so shocking and it was so heavily reported by the media. It feels like since then there's just been this explosion of knife crime. And to list a few cities, we've seen pretty high-profile instances in Perth, Melbourne, Cairns, Coffs Harbour, Dubbo. Some involve teenagers, which you've just kind of mentioned, including that really awful case out of Lake Macquarie where a 17-year-old girl allegedly stabbed her 10-year-old sister to death. It feels like there is more knife crime, but is part of the feeling, I suppose, due to renewed interest from the media, heavy media reporting?
I think it's a complex picture. I think what we've seen, especially after the Bondi attacks, I wasn't particularly concerned that we would see copycat or attacks inspired by that, because that was a particular set of circumstances, allegedly an individual who targeted women in a very public place, random women, but that was very much about potentially a hatred for women. So that was a very specific type of attack. But then, even the next day, we saw the Sydney church attack that was allegedly ideologically motivated by a young teenage boy. So I think we're seeing different things here. And I was concerned after the church attack that we might actually see other people inspired to commit the same types of acts. And certainly I think we are seeing that with young people. We're seeing a lot of that on social media, a lot of one-upmanship. Young people are carrying weapons for self-protection, but also because they're getting likes on social media. So there's a whole complex picture here of all of these different types of incidents and types of motivations that are leading to knife crime. And I think we need to unpick all of that before we can really start to understand whether it's genuinely increased, which I think it has across some of those groups, or whether it's actually media attention is more focused on it at the moment. But if it is, that's no bad thing, because certainly we do have a serious problem with knife crime in Australia.
It does seem that teenage offenders are heavily represented in recent knife crime. Is that a group that's more at risk of the so-called copycat effect, where they see it play out on their TV screens and they want to emulate it?
I think it is, yes. I think that certainly social pressure is a huge part of this for young people, but less so I think the TV screens. This is social media. This is where this is being driven from. These young people are so invested with their social media accounts, with getting likes, with getting hits, with getting comments, be those good or bad. It's about the attention seeking a lot of the time. And, we're seeing lots of different crimes increase amongst that group for the same reason. Cars being stolen. I was listening to the news earlier, Maserati was stolen and driven through the suburbs and finally brought to a halt by police. So these young people are committing these acts not because, years ago people would have stolen a Maserati to sell on and it would have been targeted. Now it's breaking into steal a really high value car because that's going to impress your friends. So we have a huge problem with knives, but we also have that massive problem with social media driving these type of events and really heavily influencing especially young people.
That's an interesting point, because I was going to talk about media responsibility in this, but I suppose we should talk about social media first then in that case. Is how do we stop that? I mean, there's a lot of conversations happening at the moment in terms of the responsibility of, Meta and TikTok in what they allow to be posted. Is it banning hashtags? Like, how can you clamp down on people posting something on social media and then others wanting to do the same thing?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, isn't it? So we saw that after the Sydney stabbing attack, the allegedly ideologically motivated attack in the church. The videos were obviously on X and they were on Meta and they were in all these other places live streamed of that particular incident. And there was a lot of push to get those social media sites to take those videos down because there is a significant danger that other people will be motivated and inspired by that violence. So I think, it's not necessarily about the mainstream media because honestly, young people are not watching the news. They're, not sitting down in front of the TV every evening, eating dinner with their parents, engaging with that content. They are online. We know that. It's really difficult to get them offline. So that's where the pressure has to come. If the driver is the social media platforms and the attention they get by posting and liking content, then that's where we have to focus our attention to break that chain because these young people are so heavily invested in their online accounts. So, I think it's a really important discussion that we're having. Do we ban young people? We were hearing that discussion just over the weekend. Young people, do we stop them having social media accounts under the age of 14? If we do, how do we do that? It's going to be a huge problem to tackle, but at least we're having these conversations because, knife crime has increased amongst young people. And we do need to do something about it to protect the community.
I want to talk about the laws that are being brought in New South Wales and that are being expanded in Queensland, which is the random wanding checks. So, police officers being able to scan random people in the street to see if they're carrying a knife or another weapon. Do you think those sort of reactions, like I said, they existed in Queensland, but they are being expanded, and in New South Wales, they're being brought in, these powers. Do you think it's a knee-jerk response or warranted?
So we're talking about Jack's Law here that were brought in, obviously, after a specific event in Queensland. And in essence, the police have the authority to randomly wand people, which is a little portable electronic device that can pick up metal. It's a metal detector. And obviously, they will be looking at young people who they think are potentially carrying illegal weapons to try and get some of those weapons off the street. Now, advocates would say in Queensland, we have seen weapons found that has protected the community to some degree. But we've also seen potentially increases in prison rates for young people who are caught more than once with a weapon, tougher bail laws. All of these things have come, to the forefront of political discussion recently. But I would caution against those knee-jerk reactions because when we hear about tougher on crime, that's the political rhetoric we will always hear, especially when we're coming up to an election. But what we know is if we get tougher on young people, which is what the community want, they want to be protected. However, we know that it doesn't work. We know that if we start sending young people to prison for longer, if we start being tougher on bail, that we will actually further criminalize them and they get caught in this cycle. And so it's really, to me, about how do we prevent young people engaging with these activities in the first place, stop them joining the groups, stop them wanting to carry weapons or feeling inspired to carry these weapons. So it's about that prevention because simply the tough on crime doesn't work. We cannot police our way out of this problem. It has to start before that. We have to divert them away from these activities. And that is a longer term game, but that's where we have to focus our attention whilst also obviously protecting the community in the meantime.
Do you think governments don't want to go down that path because it's harder and making an announcement saying, we're going to start, randomly searching people in the streets without warrant or suspicion gets those votes, as you said, gets public support because they go, oh my goodness, there's so much knife crime, they're doing something about it. Do you think it's a more attractive option for governments rather than what you've suggested, which is stopping it at the source?
Yeah, absolutely. Every time we have an election, I say to all to my students at the University of Newcastle, we're all studying criminology, and I say to them, wait for the tough on crime rhetoric to come out because it's ultimately, that's going to be a vote winner because to the public, that sounds like a good thing, right? But we have so many studies that demonstrate it just doesn't work. So it's not being soft on crime. What it is saying, look, we've tested that. We know that's not successful. We have to have a better way of doing this. But, that's not going to be politically popular because it's not going to be popular, with voters. They go, well, these are young people, they're criminals. And I put their little ditto marks. And yet, when we are labeling, and that sound, everyone's going to say, you're being really soft, we've got to punish these young people, but we know that it doesn't work. So let's do something smarter, longer term. Let's put the money into youth justice programs, earlier on diversion programs, support for families, give them more activities, sporting activities, things that are going to be pro-social, stop them engaging in the first place. But that is going to take a number of years to put into place. But I urge the politicians to do that now, and we will reap the rewards in the future.
Look, before we let you go, Xanthe, I wanted to ask you about what role you think the media should play in this. And this is in the, the larger perspective, not just for youth knife crime, but across the board. What does responsible reporting look like on these sort of crimes?
That is a great question. I mean, I would love to see the media, when they do report these high-profile events, to be very victim-focused, for example. So a lot of the time the victims get forgotten in all of this. And I think we are changing as a society, and that is improving. We do need to acknowledge the offender, in that we need to learn from that event to try and stop it happening again, but we can't forget the victims. And also, when we do report on things like knife crimes, reporting the genuine statistics, so that we don't want to create undue fear in the community. We want the community to understand what the risks are, but some people will feel those risks more than others. And we want to make sure that those vulnerable groups are not unduly fearful of crimes that are highly unlikely to happen because they're getting a lot of media reporting at the moment. So make sure that it's all balanced and reasoned and justified with the data.
Xanthe Mallett, thanks so much for your time today and for sharing your thoughts with us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all for this episode. A reminder, we put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom to see them. You can also catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom. We're also on Instagram, which is at The Briefing Podcast. And before you go, if you liked this ep, why not share it with someone you think might enjoy it too? I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.
Listener.